Welcome to another of the E-Biology Teacher Podcasts. I'm Mr. Doc, and today our topic is photosynthesis. Yes, the word that most people think of when they think of biology, because yes, kids, it's that important. Hi, how are you? Today we're going to talk about photosynthesis, but first we're going to start with sort of a crash course on cellular energy. You see, we've already talked about cell transport and how sometimes that requires energy and sometimes it doesn't. What we didn't say is how do you get the energy in the first place? Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, cellular energy can be broken down really into three topics. Number one, what is cellular energy? Number two, we've got photosynthesis, and then finally we've got cellular respiration. So today we're going to intro energy and talk about photosynthesis. We're going to talk about the different kinds of energy. We're going to talk about the molecules required for photosynthesis, and we are going to learn what we call the summary equation for photosynthesis. We're going to talk about different roles that the Calvin cycle versus the light reactions of photosynthesis play. Yes, there's more than one part of photosynthesis, and we're going to evaluate why photosynthesis is important. So let's go ahead and get started with an idea about energy. Energy is simply defined as the ability to do work. And of course, we are required to breathe, we're required to circulate our blood. All of this stuff requires energy. Now, there are two types of organisms on the planet. There are those that have the ability to produce their own energy, or I should say convert their own energy from sunlight or other means. And then you have those organisms that have to consume other organisms for their energy. Autotrophs, also called producers, are organisms that can create their own food by converting sunlight into a different form of energy. Plants are producers. Most algae are producers. Some protists, like euglena, are producers. Some bacteria are even producers. So that means that autotrophs have the ability, auto meaning self, troph meaning energy, to self-energize using, without consuming something else. Heterotrophs, or different energy, can't create their own food and therefore must consume organisms for their energy. All right, of course, animals being an example of a producer, or excuse me, a consumer. And let me go back and head that up. Heterotrophs are also called consumers because they must consume. All right? Now, there are different forms of energy. The functional part of energy for living things, all living things as a matter of fact, is ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. And that's the functional energy for all living things. It's how we survive. ATP is a form of potential energy because potential energy is stored energy. Now, there are tons of different types of potential energy. Gasoline, for example, is stored energy. It's got potential to express its energy. All right, burning wood is an example of releasing potential energy. The food we eat contains potential energy, which we then convert to a different type of potential energy that we can't actually release. Because when it comes down to it, it's not whether you have the energy present, it's whether you have the ability to harness that energy to do what you want it to do. All right. So if I were sitting around, I was trapped on top of a mountain and I didn't have any food, but I had plenty of gasoline. Well, that didn't do me any good because I can't convert gasoline. I can't make gasoline what I need it to be. I have to have certain types of food that I can then convert. So potential energy is important, but keep in mind you have to have the right kind of potential energy. When energy is released, it can be converted into kinetic energy, which is energy in the form of movement, or thermal energy, which is energy in the form of heat, even though both of those are actually very closely related. When you think of kinetic energy, most people think of a car moving down the road. That car has in itself kinetic energy, but that car also produces heat, which we call thermal energy. And thermal energy is actually a measurement of how the atoms or molecules in a substance are moving. Okay, so kinetic energy is sort of a macro movement, how an object itself moves. Thermal energy is actually the measurement of energy of movement of the particles that make it up, and we measure that in the form of heat. And this is a good time to talk about efficiency. You see, the second law of thermodynamics tells us, not that you need to know the second law of thermodynamics, but it tells us that no energy conversion is 100% efficient. It tells us that if we have this much energy, we can convert it, but we're only going to get about that much energy that we can use. The rest of it's going to go off in a different form of energy that we can't use. That's absolutely true. Let's say of your car, for example. When you put gasoline into your car burns the gasoline and converts that into movement. That's great. But only about 18% of that fuel is used for movement, which means for every dollar you spend on gasoline, only 18 cents of every dollar is going to movement. What happens to the other 72%? Well, that goes off in the form of heat, which explains why your car hood heats up when your car's been running for a little while. That heat is wasted energy. It's energy that, while we were able to convert from potential energy to heat energy, it's not energy that we have the ability to harness and to use to do the work that we want to do. So that means that no energy relationship is completely efficient. All right, it means that we're going to lose some energy. Not that energy can be destroyed, but we're going to lose it in the form of a type of energy that we can't use, most of the time in the form of heat. All right, so ATP. Now, we've been talking about ATP for quite some time now, but not talking about exactly what it is. ATP is a molecule that consists of an adenosine group right here and 3 phosphate groups. But here's the thing. The secret of life. Well, you didn't know you were going to learn that today, did you? The secret of life. The reason why any and everything on this planet is alive lies on this screen. And it's right here. See that? Right there in between those phosphate groups is the secret to life. That bond that's holding those 2 phosphates together holds energy. And when we break that bond, the energy comes out, and that's the energy that's responsible for everything that is the human experience and life on this planet as a whole, because every organism gets its energy from right there. So no organisms could survive without energy. We know that because that's metabolism, and that's a characteristic of life, which we learned in our first unit. But what we know now is that that's where it comes from. Right there. Right there. See it? All right? So what happens is when we break that bond, the energy comes out, and we're left with an ADP molecule and a free phosphate. Now those two can be reattached, and we have this whole process over and over again. But that's where the energy of life comes from. Right there. So if we have the ability to make those compounds stick, if we have the ability to form those bonds, we have the ability to harness the power of energy. All right? Now, let's take a look at photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is important because it takes the energy from the sun and stores it into ATP in an organelle called the chloroplast. Now, a chloroplast contains a pigment called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is green in color, and it absorbs red and blue light while reflecting green light. And when we reflect green light, it appears green. Hence why green plants have green leaves, because of the chlorophyll. Now, the general chemical equation, or what we call the summary chemical equation, is right here. We start out with carbon dioxide and water, and we produce glucose and oxygen. Now, some people might say, well, Mr. Doc, that's not balanced. You happen to be right. It should be 6 carbon dioxides, 6 waters, and you produce 1 glucose and 6 oxygens. But this ain't chemistry class. I just wanted to show you the summary equation. Now, what I do want to mention is this. Mr. Doc, I thought you said that photosynthesis converted sunlight into ATP, yet ATP is not in the summary equation for photosynthesis. That's because it's a summary equation. ATP is merely a step along in the process. You see, this is what we start with, carbon dioxide and water. This is what we end with, glucose and oxygen. But right here, this little arrow, you want to know what's happening there? This. Oh, come on. Here we go. This is the process of photosynthesis. It's incredibly complicated. Lots of stuff going on here, right? All of this stuff is going on during that arrow that you see, okay? So that's why we use the summary equation, because I gotta be honest with you, I don't know all this stuff. I mean, I know about it, but I don't know all of it, okay? So what we want to understand is, in the summary equation, what parts need to come in, kind of what happens a little bit during, and ultimately what comes out. Because that's really the end of the ballgame for our freshman level biology, is what goes in, what comes out, right? So here's what I'd like for us to do. We're going to set a goal. I want you to follow along as we continue our discussion, and I want you to determine what role each one of these four things plays. Meaning, where does carbon dioxide come in? Where does water come in? Where does glucose come out? And where does oxygen come out? And I'd also like for you to look for ATP, because ATP, even though it's not in the summary equation, does play an important role. And if ever you want to know, man, biology is really hard. Oh, why can't we keep stop? You could be studying this. I'm just saying. Okay? All right, so let's start photosynthesis in the place where photosynthesis happens, in the chloroplast. The chloroplast consists of small membrane structures called thylakoids, and those are stacked into membranes. Each of these little things that looks like a poker chip is a thylakoid, and each stack of poker chips is a grana, or excuse me, a granum, a singular granum, and then multiple grana. Okay. Thylakoids contain stacks of chlorophyll called photostems, and the area in between the thylakoids is called the stroma. Light is absorbed by this little organelle, keeping in mind that this organelle is inside a plant cell or some other organism that has them, not animals. Light is absorbed, and it charges electrons and protons and atoms. It gets things excited, and that's when the photosynthesis process happens. Okay? Now, what's going to happen here is, in the thylakoid membrane, we are going to take water, and we are going to break it down into its parts. Now remember, water is oxygen and two hydrogens. Well, when oxygen and hydrogen are bonded to water, it's like a mom walking down the street with her two children by their hand. The kids are under control because mommy is right there. And everybody is perfectly content and happy as we walk down the street. There's no commotion. That's kind of just the way things are. But if mommy lets go, the kids go nuts and everything. Okay, right? That's kind of what happens. But that's what light can do to water in the chloroplast. That oxygen lets go of those hydrogens, and those hydrogens just go crazy. They absorb all that light energy. They're raised up to the next level, and boy, they're really excited, and they're ready to go. So what's going to happen is the energy from these are going to go through this molecule here, which we're going to call ATP synthase. And that energy is going to be focused right here to form that third bond that we've been talking about so much. Then we have ATP, right? That also puts us to a situation. We've used water. We've broken it up. So that's why we have to have water in the summary equation. But if we're using the hydrogen to store that energy, that means that oxygen that has let go is now free. We've produced water. Or we've produced oxygen. Sorry. We've used water and we've produced oxygen from it. Aren't we brilliant? And haven't we crossed two things off of our list that we were supposed to do? We've determined where water goes into the equation, and we've determined where the oxygen comes from. Bravo. Now we have to look at carbon dioxide and glucose, which is obviously coming up here in a minute. We've also found something else. Where does ATP come in? We've made ATP. Remember? These guys focus in, harness their energy, form that bond, and this little thing, this adenosine diphosphate and this phosphate bond together to form an ATP molecule. Now, once we have the ATP molecule, it's a little volatile, which means we got to find a way to store it. I don't carry cash. I never have, and there's one major reason why. If I have cash, I spend it, right? ATP is kind of the same way. It's volatile. It wants to be spent. It doesn't want to sit around in a pocket somewhere. It wants to do its job. It wants to provide energy. So if we want to save that energy for a later date, we need to put it into a more long-term storage facility called glucose, and that's where the Calvin cycle comes into play. The Calvin cycle takes, and this occurs, by the way, in the dark or in the light. Okay, this does not have to happen in the light. It takes the ATP and the carbon dioxide and stores them together into a complex molecule called glucose, which is a form of carbohydrate. So basically what's occurring here is we're taking the ATP and we're storing it in a different format, and the format of glucose has a longer shelf life, meaning that it can stay around longer without having to give up its energy. The Calvin cycle is often referred to as the dark reactions of photosynthesis because it does not require light to happen. Now, there is a little bit of confusion here. The light reactions of photosynthesis had to happen first because remember, Calvin cycle is a way of storing ATP. Well, the light reactions of photosynthesis is what produces the ATP, and then the Calvin cycle is what converts ATP into glucose. Now, we've accounted for everything. We know that water comes in the light reactions of photosynthesis and is broken down. The extra oxygen is released, and we also know that the carbon dioxide goes into the Calvin cycle and is connected together to form a more complex carbohydrate called glucose, and that is part of photosynthesis. I'll also mention that in the Calvin cycle, more oxygen is also released because carbon dioxide provides a lot more oxygen than we really need. Okay? And that's it. That's the long and short of photosynthesis. But why is it important? Well, remember that animals are heterotrophs and therefore can't produce our own energy. We depend on other organisms. Accordingly, food webs start out with producers. They always are going to because somebody's got to get their energy from the sun because sun is indirectly or directly the lead source of energy on the planet. Now, you don't have the ability to convert solar energy into useful energy for you, but you require plants. Think about the hamburger you ate. Well, where did the energy in the hamburger come from? Well, from the cow. Where did the cow get the energy? From the grass. Where did the grass get its energy? From the sun. Okay? So everything you eat comes, everything that you eat for energy, I should say, comes directly or indirectly from the sun in one way or another. That's important to note. So photosynthesis is the way that happens. So photosynthesis ultimately is the way you get energy, even though you can't do it. You depend on other organisms to do it for you, which is why we're consumers. We let them do the dirty work, and then we eat them. And that's how we get our energy. All right? A couple other things about photosynthesis that are important to note. Number one, the byproduct is oxygen, and I don't know about you, but I like a little bit of oxygen every now and then. Photosynthesis is responsible for over 90% of the photosynthesis, of the oxygen that's produced on the planet. Photosynthesis is responsible for about 90% of the world's oxygen. And about 90% of that number is produced by algae, not plants. That's right. A little known fact, algae produces more oxygen during photosynthesis than plants do. Does that make sense? Absolutely, because algae grows in the water, and water covers about 80% of the planet, which means that there's more algae than there are plants because you don't see big trees growing out in the middle of the ocean, do you? Right? So algae are what's producing most of the oxygen through photosynthesis, and that's important. We love algae, even though if you step out in the middle of a creek during the summertime and you're like, it's gross, creepy, sticky, nasty stuff. That's algae. It's actually a pretty good friend of yours, and it's probably not going to harm you at all anyway. All right? And finally, it is important to note that photosynthesis can be affected by either the lack of carbon dioxide or too much carbon dioxide. It certainly won't happen if there's not enough light, if there's not enough water, or in extreme temperatures. It won't happen outside a comfortable range of temperatures, which is why, by the way, if you see the plants up north, they're a lot different than the plants down south. That's because it's colder. The plants have had to adapt to doing photosynthesis at colder temperatures. I also want to mention something else. Carbon dioxide. If you don't have enough, you can't produce glucose. Sorry. So that means you got to have enough, but you can't have too much. Think about going to a Chinese buffet. Okay? You go there to get energy. You got to eat, so you get energy. So you start eating, and you have the muguga pan, and you have the kung pao chicken, and you have the sweet and sour chicken, and you have the mushy pork, and you have yum, yum, yum. And you keep eating, and you keep eating, and you keep eating. But somehow you leave, and you're like, oh, I ate too much. And you actually have less energy than when you went in. It's because you've bogged down the system. You put too much fuel in. Same is true with plants. If there's too much, they can bog down. It's kind of like flooding your car. If you press the gas pedal without the car being on and you try to start it, it's not going to start. Put too much gas in the system. It's got to roll itself out. All right? So that's our conversation on photosynthesis. Let's see what we've learned. First of all, potential energy is the potential to do work, and kinetic energy is energy in the form of movement. In other words, potential energy has been released, and it results in kinetic energy. A different form of kinetic energy is thermal energy, which is the movement of the particles that make up a substance, whereas kinetic energy generally talks about an object itself moving. The molecules and conditions required for photosynthesis to occur include, number one, you must have carbon dioxide and you must have water. You must also have sunlight for the light reactions to occur, and that will produce for you glucose and oxygen. And that means that our summary equation is 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters yields 1 glucose and 6 oxygens. The role of the Calvin cycle takes the ATP produced during the light reactions of photosynthesis and stores it in a glucose molecule for long-term storage. And finally, why is photosynthesis important to the world? It's because sunlight is the ultimate source of energy for the planet, and any living organism depends directly or indirectly on the sun, whether you want to admit it or not. And you know what? We're an energy-using society. Most of our energy comes directly or indirectly from the sun. Like, by the way, gasoline. It's a fossil fuel. Fossil fuels are made from decaying old matter that died many, many years ago. Well, that was once alive, which means that at some point something did photosynthesis. So all of that energy in gasoline is actually fossilized solar energy, basically, right? Oh, but what about wind power? Wind is caused by differences in temperature. Wind blows from hot to cold, right? Well, the only reason air masses are hot or cold is because either the presence or absence of the heat from the sun. So wind power is technically solar power. Same with currents, okay? So hydroelectric power is the same thing. You need the sun, and you need photosynthesis. So you might as well learn to like it because it's there. It's important. And if you don't learn it now, it's going to come back to haunt you. All right, so learn your photosynthesis. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Come back later for our discussion on cellular respiration. Photosynthesis, evil twin brother. Actually, it's not really evil. It's necessary. It's cool. You'll see when you see me there. All right, talk to you later. Bye.